My son Jason stood in my kitchen, his face a mask of contempt. His wife, Crystal, stood behind him, nodding like a bobblehead doll. "We need the money, Mom," he'd said, his voice rising. "Just sell the car." I had refused, and he had finally screamed, his voice echoing in the small house. "It's just a rusty old bucket." He didn't know that rusty old bucket was a 1966 Shelby GT350 H, his father's masterpiece. And he had no idea that by insulting his father's legacy, he hadn't just demanded a vacation. He had just funded my spectacular globe-trotting revenge. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Vivian Laurent. For 45 years, I was the wife of the greatest car man who ever lived, Franklin Laurent, and together we ran Laurent Restorations. This is the story of how I used my husband's final masterpiece to teach our son a multi-million-dollar lesson in respect. My son Jason stood in my kitchen, his face a mask of contempt that was so foreign, so ugly, it felt like a stranger had broken into my house and was wearing my child's skin. His wife, Crystal, stood just behind his right shoulder, a perfectly coiffed and manicured parrot, nodding in rhythmic, venomous agreement with every word he spoke. The air in the room, usually warm and smelling of the lemon oil I used on the old pine table, was now thick and sour with a resentment so potent it felt like it was stealing the oxygen from my lungs. "We need the money, Mom," he'd said, his voice a low, insistent growl that had been steadily rising in volume for the past 10 minutes. "It's not a request anymore. It's a necessity." I had remained silent, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, my gaze fixed on the familiar grain of the wood before me. I was tracing the lines with my eyes, trying to anchor myself to something solid, something real, in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. My silence, my refusal to be drawn into his frantic, grasping energy, was fuel to his fire. He saw it not as the stunned sorrow of a mother, but as the stubborn refusal of a gatekeeper. "Are you even listening to me?" he demanded, taking a step closer, his expensive Italian leather shoes squeaking on my clean linoleum floor. "Crystal's brand depends on this. This isn't just a vacation, it's a business trip. It's content. It's engagement. It's the kind of thing you wouldn't understand." I looked up then, my eyes meeting his. The son I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose first broken heart I had mended, was gone. In his place was this man, his face flushed with a mixture of entitlement and fury, his eyes holding a chilling dismissiveness. He looked at me, his own mother, and saw an obstacle. An old, simple-minded woman who didn't understand the modern world of brands and content. He had no idea that for 40 years, I had run a multi-million-dollar business built on a brand more solid, more respected, and more valuable than his wife's fleeting social media fantasy could ever be. The brand of Laurent Restorations. I finally spoke, my voice quiet, but carrying a weight that seemed to surprise him. "I understand that you want me to give you a very large sum of money for a trip. I understand that you believe you are entitled to it. What I don't understand, Jason, is why you believe my answer would be yes." Crystal let out an audible scoff from behind him, a sound like air leaking from a cheap inflatable. "Because you have it, Vivian," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine poison. "It's just sitting there collecting dust. What good is it doing anyone?" My gaze shifted to her. Crystal, with her perfect teeth and her empty eyes. She was the architect of this new, ugly chapter in my son's life. She had cultivated his insecurities, nurtured his resentments, and honed his greed into a sharp, piercing weapon, a weapon he was now aiming directly at my heart. "What I have," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel, "is what your father-in-law and I worked for. Every single day for 45 years. It is not just sitting there. It is the sum total of a life's work. A legacy." Jason threw his hands up in the air, a gesture of performative exasperation. "Oh, here we go. The legacy speech. The greasy rags and the smell of gasoline. We get it. You worked hard. Dad worked hard. But he's gone now. And that work is supposed to mean something for the living, not just for your memories." He took another step, his hands now planted on my kitchen table, leaning over me, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "We're not asking for the house. We're not asking for your savings. Just sell the car." "Car." He said the words with such casual, dismissive contempt, as if he were talking about a piece of old, broken furniture. He had no concept of what he was asking. He was asking me to liquidate his father's soul. He was asking me to put a price tag on the final, most beautiful piece of art my husband Franklin had ever created. I shook my head, a slow, deliberate motion. No, Jason. Absolutely not. And that's when he broke. The carefully constructed facade of the successful real estate agent, the patient son dealing with a difficult old mother, shattered into a million pieces. His face, which had been tight with controlled anger, twisted into a mask of pure, ugly, uncontrolled rage. He straightened up, his fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling. He looked past me through the small kitchen window to the closed garage door on the other side of the driveway. The garage that had been his father's sanctuary, his studio, his cathedral. Why? He screamed, the sound so loud, so raw that the teacup in my hands rattled. Why not? It's useless. It just sits in there under a dusty old sheet. You don't drive it. You don't do anything with it. It's just a piece of junk. It's just a rusty old bucket. The words echoed in the sudden ringing silence of the kitchen. A rusty old bucket. He had taken the single most valuable, most beautiful, most meaningful object in my entire life and reduced it to junk. He had looked at his father's masterpiece, a 1966 Shelby GT350 H. A car so rare, so perfectly restored that collectors from around the world had made pilgrimages to our small shop just to look at it, and he had seen nothing. He saw no history, no artistry, no legacy. He saw only a potential check, a means to an end, a rusty bucket standing in the way of his wife's next Instagram post from a beach in Bali. In that moment something inside me shifted. The deep aching grief I had felt for the son I had lost was cauterized by a sudden cold and clarifying anger. He didn't know what the car was. He didn't know it was a rolling piece of American history, a legend of the track, a car that could command a price of over $1.5 million at auction. He didn't know because he had never cared enough to ask, to listen, to learn. He had spent his entire life being willfully, arrogantly blind to the value of his own heritage. And as I looked at his furious, ignorant face, a new and terrible resolve was born. He wanted the car sold. He wanted the money. Fine. I would sell the car. But the money, the spectacular, life-changing sum of money it would bring, would not fund his vacation. It would fund a lesson. A lesson in respect, in history, and in the devastating consequences of underestimating a quiet, grieving woman who had finally been pushed too far. He had just demanded a vacation. He had no idea he had just funded my spectacular, globe-trotting revenge. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Vivian Laurent. For 45 years I was the wife of the greatest car man who ever lived, Franklin Laurent, and together we ran Laurent Restorations. This is not a story about a car. It is a story about value. It's about the difference between the price of something and its worth. It's about the legacy you build with your own two hands, and the ignorance of those who would sell it for a fleeting moment of shallow gratification. This is the story of how I used my husband's final masterpiece to teach our son a multi-million-dollar lesson in respect he would never, ever forget. My husband, Franklin, was a poet whose medium was steel and leather. He didn't just fix cars, he understood them. He could listen to an engine and diagnose its ailments with the precision of a master surgeon. He could look at a mangled piece of rusted metal and see, with the eye of a sculptor, the beautiful flowing lines of the machine it was meant to be. Our shop, Laurent Restorations, was a small, unassuming brick building on the industrial side of town. To the casual observer it was just another garage. But to a very specific, very wealthy and very knowledgeable clientele, it was a holy place. It was where automotive history was not just preserved but resurrected. I was not a mechanic. My hands were clean. My domain was the small, tidy office at the front of the shop. I was the historian, the logistician, the financial architect of our shared dream. While Franklin was in the back, covered in grease and lost in the symphony of a finely tuned engine, I was on the phone with a parts dealer in Italy, hunting down a specific, period-correct headlamp for a 1958 Ferrari. I was in the archives, poring over old manufacturing records to ensure the paint color on a 1930s Duesenberg was an exact chemical match to the original. I was the one who negotiated the contracts, who managed the payroll, who built the relationships with the collectors and the museums. He was the artist. I was the curator, the producer, the one who made the art possible. We were a team, a perfect symbiotic partnership, and together we built a reputation that was as solid and as shining as the chrome on one of our finished creations. We raised our son Jason in this world. The shop was his playground. The smell of oil and metal was the scent of his childhood. He grew up surrounded by men and women who were masters of their craft, artisans who took immense pride in the skill of their hands. We tried to teach him the value of that work. We tried to show him the beauty in taking something broken and making it whole again. We tried to instill in him the quiet dignity of a blue-collar life lived with passion and integrity. For a time we thought we had succeeded. But as he grew older, the world outside the garage began to whisper a different, more seductive story in his ear. It was a story of white collars and clean hands, of easy money and social status. He went to college, the first in our family, and came back a different person. He was ashamed of us. He was embarrassed by his father's grease-stained hands and my practical work-worn clothes. He would bring his new slick friends around, and he would introduce us with a kind of pained apology in his voice, as if we were a regrettable but necessary part of his past. He became a real estate agent, a job that seemed to perfectly suit his new obsession with the superficial appearance of success. He measured his worth in commission checks and the brand name on his suit. He had completely and totally rejected the world that had built him. And then he met Crystal. She was the catalyst, the accelerant that turned his simmering shame into a raging fire of contempt. She was a woman who lived her life through the lens of her phone, a self-proclaimed influencer whose entire identity was a carefully curated collection of luxury goods and exotic locations. She saw us, his parents, as a down-market brand affiliation, a pair of embarrassing working-class relics who were holding her husband back from the glamorous life she believed they deserved. When Franklin passed away, their disrespect became more overt. They saw his death not as a tragedy but as an opportunity. They began to look at our life's work, at the assets we had so carefully and painstakingly built, not as a legacy to be honored, but as a bank account to be liquidated. They were circling, vultures waiting for the moment they could pick the bones of his life clean. And the prize they had set their sights on, the single greatest object we had ever created together, was sitting under a canvas sheet in my garage. It was the culmination of everything we were, everything we believed in. And to them it was just a rusty old bucket. The foundation of our entire life, the bedrock upon which Lauron Restorations was built, was a shared belief in the idea of permanence. In a world that was becoming increasingly disposable, Franklin and I were drawn to things that were built to last. Things with history, with soul. And nothing embodied that philosophy more than the American muscle car. For Franklin, they were more than just machines. They were a kind of raw, kinetic sculpture, a perfect fusion of power and beauty. He loved them all, but he revered the Shelby. Carroll Shelby was his hero, a man who had taken the humble workaday Mustang and transformed it into a world-beating champion. For years, Franklin dreamed of finding and restoring a very specific Shelby. Not just any GT350, but a GT350 H. This stood for Hertz. In 1966, in one of the most brilliant marketing moves in automotive history, Shelby made a deal with the Hertz rental car company to create a fleet of special high-performance GT350s that the average person could rent for $17 a day. They were known as the rent-a-racers. People would rent them on a Friday, take them to the track, race them all weekend, often crudely repainting them to hide their origins, and then return them battered and bruised on a Monday morning. They were legends, mythical beasts of the asphalt, and because of the hard lives they lived, very few survived. Finding a genuine, numbers-matching GT350 H was the holy grail for collectors. We found ours 20 years ago, not in a pristine collection, but rotting in a barn in rural Pennsylvania. It was a ghost, a wreck. It had been raced, crashed, and left for dead. The iconic black and gold Hertz paint scheme was hidden under 3 layers of cheap, peeling red. The engine was seized, the interior was a disaster, and the body was a patchwork of rust and regret. To anyone else it was junk. To Franklin it was the perfect canvas. The restoration of the Shelby became his life's great project, his Sistine Chapel. It was not a job for a client. It was a personal obsession. He poured every spare moment, every ounce of his skill and passion into that car. I became the project's historian. I spent years hunting down the rarest, most obscure parts. I found a set of original Coney shocks in a dusty warehouse in Ohio. I tracked down the correct 1-year-only rear axle from a collector in Belgium. I spent 6 months authenticating the serial numbers, cross-referencing them with the original Shelby American factory records, proving beyond any doubt that our car was not just a GT350H, but one of the first 50 ever built, a car with a documented race history. Jason was a teenager when we brought the car home. For a while he was fascinated. Franklin tried to teach him to pass on the skills, the passion. He showed him how to weld, how to tune a carburetor, how to feel the language of the machine. But the allure of video games and girls and the easy, clean life of his suburban friends was too strong. He grew bored of the slow, painstaking work. He started to see the garage not as a place of magic but as a chore. The car became a symbol of the life he was so desperate to escape. The restoration took the better part of 2 decades. It was a slow, methodical, and deeply loving process. Franklin rebuilt the 289 cubic inch V8 engine by hand, piece by piece, tuning it not just to factory specifications but beyond. He straightened the frame, replaced the rusted metal, and prepared the body for paint with the meticulous care of a Renaissance master preparing a canvas. The day he finally laid down the last coat of glossy raven black paint and the iconic gold Le Mans stripes, he stood back, his face streaked with sweat and tears, and he said to me, "That's it, Vivian. That's the one. That's the best I can do." It was more than a car. It was a time capsule. It was a rolling, fire-breathing monument to a forgotten era of American ingenuity. It was the physical embodiment of my husband's talent, his passion, his life's philosophy. It was our masterpiece. And after he was gone, it became the most sacred object in my life. It was his last, beautiful, perfect creation. It was everything we had built together, sitting under a canvas sheet, waiting. The rot began subtly, like the first, almost imperceptible spots of rust on a pristine piece of chrome. It was a slow, creeping corrosion of the values we had worked so hard to instill in our son. Jason's shame over his blue-collar roots didn't appear overnight. It was a gradual accumulation of small slights, of quiet embarrassments, of the constant, insidious pressure of a world that values the salesman more than the craftsman. When he was in college, he stopped bringing his friends home. On the rare occasions he did, he would steer them away from the garage, a place he had once proudly shown off. He would refer to his father's life's work as a hobby, as if the business that had paid for his education was a quaint little pastime. He started to talk about money in a different way. It was no longer something you earned through hard work and skill. It was something you leveraged, something you played with. He was learning a new language, the language of the boardroom and the country club, and it was a language that had no words for the quiet dignity of his own father. His marriage to Crystal was the moment the slow rot became a galloping cancer. Crystal was a woman who was allergic to authenticity. Her entire life was a performance for an unseen audience on the internet. She saw the world not as a place to be experienced, but as a series of backdrops for her photos. She judged everything and everyone by a single brutal metric. Did it enhance her brand? And we, his working-class parents with our modest home and our garage that smelled of honest labor, did not enhance her brand. Their visits became an exercise in passive-aggressive criticism. Crystal would walk into my clean, comfortable home and her eyes would dart around, cataloging the things she found lacking. "Oh, Vivian," she'd say, running a perfectly manicured finger over my solid, well-loved oak dining table. "Have you ever thought about getting something a little more modern? A bit more minimalist?" She wasn't offering design advice. She was passing judgment on my entire life. They would talk about their friends, their vacations, their purchases, in a loud, relentless litany of brand names and price tags. It was a performance for my benefit, a clumsy, cruel attempt to make me feel small, to make me feel that the life Franklin and I had built was somehow less than theirs. They were so blinded by the glitter of their new leveraged world that they couldn't see the solid gold of the world they had come from. The car in the garage became a particular point of contention. To them, it was the ultimate symbol of everything they were trying to escape. It was old. It was loud. It was, in their eyes, a piece of junk. Crystal would wrinkle her nose at the faint smell of gasoline that sometimes wafted from the garage. "I just don't get it," she'd say to Jason loudly enough for me to hear. "Why does she hang on to that old thing? It's an eyesore. It's dragging down the property value." Jason, to my eternal sorrow, would just nod in agreement, too weak or too cowed to defend his own father's legacy. He saw the car through her eyes now. It was no longer a masterpiece of restoration, a symbol of his father's genius. It was an embarrassment, a relic, a rusty old bucket. Their financial situation I knew was a house of cards. Jason was a decent real estate agent, but he lived in a world of feast or famine. When the market was hot, he made a fortune. When it was cold, he made nothing. But their spending, fueled by Crystal's insatiable need for new content, was a constant raging inferno. They were living far beyond their means, funding their glamorous lifestyle with credit cards and lines of credit, always chasing the next big commission to keep the whole fragile charade from collapsing. They began to hint, then to ask, then to demand money. At first it was small loans for a cash flow problem. I would give it to them, telling myself it was what a mother does. But the requests grew larger, more frequent, more insistent. They saw me not as their mother but as an untapped resource, a personal ATM. My savings, the nest egg Franklin and I had so carefully built, was, in their eyes, their emergency fund. The final, fatal confrontation was inevitable. It was the culmination of years of simmering resentment, of 1,000 small cuts of disrespect. Crystal had planned a trip, a month-long 5-country tour of Europe that was, in her words, a career-defining opportunity. It was a ridiculously expensive, over-the-top fantasy of 5-star hotels and Michelin-starred restaurants. And they expected me to pay for it. The demand was the final, undeniable proof that the son I had raised was gone. He had been completely consumed by the shallow, grasping world he had chosen. And he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The demand, when it came, was not a request. It was an ultimatum delivered with the cold, hard certainty of a hostage negotiator who knows he has all the leverage. They had cornered me in my own kitchen, a tag team of entitlement, with a well-rehearsed script and a shared, unblinking conviction that they were in the right. Jason played the role of the reluctant but firm son, while Crystal provided the emotional, high-stakes justification. "It's an investment, Mom," Jason began, his tone a careful blend of reasonableness and condescension. "You have to think of it like an investment in our future. In your grandchildren's future." They had no children, a fact that made the statement all the more manipulative. Crystal chimed in, her voice a dramatic, breathy whisper. "My followers are expecting this, Vivian. I've been teasing a huge European announcement for weeks. My engagement numbers are through the roof. I have brands, major luxury brands, who are interested in partnering with me on this. This trip will pay for itself 10 times over in the long run. But we need the initial capital to make it happen. We need to show them we're serious." I listened, my expression a placid, unreadable mask. I let them lay out their entire sordid business proposal. They had spreadsheets. They had a PowerPoint presentation on Crystal's tablet, filled with glossy photos of the hotels she wanted to stay in and the designer clothes she wanted to wear. It was the most ludicrous, self-serving, and deeply insulting presentation I had ever seen. They were asking me to liquidate a piece of my husband's soul to pay for their Instagram fantasy. When they were finished, they looked at me, their faces alight with a greedy, confident expectation. They had made their case. They had demonstrated the return on investment. They had, in their minds, closed the deal. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. "The answer," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "is no." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The air, which had been thick with their manufactured excitement, suddenly crackled with a stunned, angry energy. Jason's face, which had been a mask of persuasive charm, hardened into a scowl of disbelief. "No?" he repeated as if he had never heard the word before. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," I said, my gaze unwavering. "I will not be funding your vacation. It is a frivolous and irresponsible expense, and I will not be a party to it." Crystal gasped, a theatrical, wounded sound. "Frivolous? Vivian, this is my career we're talking about. This is our future." "Your career," I said, turning my gaze to her, "is your responsibility. Your future is yours to build. Franklin and I built ours with our own 2 hands without asking for a penny from anyone. I suggest you learn to do the same." That was when Jason's carefully controlled facade began to crumble. "This is unbelievable," he sputtered, his voice rising. "After everything I've done for you? All the times I've come over to fix your computer, to help you with your banking? This is how you repay me." "You are my son, Jason," I said, my voice laced with a sorrow he was too enraged to hear. "Helping your mother is not a transaction. It is not something you do to be repaid. It is when the mother is sitting on a gold mine and refusing to help her own family," he shot back, his voice getting louder, uglier. "You have no idea what it's like out there. Pressure. The competition. We need this. I need this. He was pacing now, a caged animal, his fists clenched, his face a dark, thunderous red. He was no longer the slick real estate agent. He was a desperate, cornered man, and his true, ugly nature was coming to the surface. You and Dad, you had it easy, he yelled, his words a torrent of long-simmering resentment. You hid away in your greasy garage playing with your old toys while the real world passed you by. You have no idea what it takes to be successful in this world. It takes image. It takes status. It takes money. He stopped his pacing and pointed a trembling finger at me. You owe me this, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. For all the years I had to be embarrassed of you. For all the times I had to lie about what my father did for a living. You owe me. The cruelty of that statement, the sheer, breathtaking selfishness of it, landed like a physical blow. But I would not let him see my pain. I would not give him the satisfaction. I stood up, my own anger a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I owe you nothing, Jason. This conversation is over. I turned to walk away, and that's when he delivered the final, fatal blow. He strode past me to the kitchen window and pointed a shaking finger at the garage. Fine, he screamed, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate fury. Don't give me your savings. I don't want it. But you are going to sell that car. You are going to sell that stupid, useless, rusty old bucket, and you are going to give me the money. The words, the final, unforgivable insult to his father's memory, hung in the air, a poison that could never be taken back. He had finally said it. He had finally revealed the true depth of his contempt. And in doing so he had just sealed his own fate. In the ringing silence that followed his outburst, a strange and profound calm settled over me. The pain was still there, a deep aching wound in my soul, but it was now overlaid with a layer of ice-cold clarity. The son I had loved was well and truly gone, and the man standing in his place was a stranger, a greedy, petulant child in a 40-year-old's body. And you do not argue with a child throwing a tantrum. You do not reason with a fool. You simply and quietly decide on the appropriate form of discipline. I turned back to face him, my expression unreadable. I let him stand there, his chest heaving, his face a mask of self-righteous fury, and I watched the last vestiges of my maternal affection for him wither and die. He was no longer my son to be protected. He was an adversary to be defeated. I took a slow, deep breath. You know what, Jason? I said, my voice so calm, so reasonable that it completely disarmed him. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, clearly expecting more tears, more arguments, more resistance. You're right. The two words had a stunning effect. He blinked, his angry posture deflating slightly in confusion. Crystal, who had been watching the scene with a look of smug satisfaction, now looked equally bewildered. I'm right. Jason stammered. Yes, I said, nodding slowly as if a great truth had just been revealed to me. You're absolutely right. It's just a car. An old car. It just sits in the garage. My sentimentality is clouding my judgment. It's a depreciating asset, and it's time to be practical. I walked back to the table and sat down, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked up at them, my face a mask of serene, maternal capitulation. Your father, he would have wanted me to be practical. He would have wanted me to help my family. You're my only family. Of course I'll sell the car. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and absolute. Jason's face, which had been a thundercloud of rage, broke into a radiant, triumphant smile. He looked at Crystal, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe his bullying had worked so effectively. Crystal rushed forward and enveloped me in a hug that felt as cold and as brittle as glass. Oh, Vivian, she gushed, her voice a symphony of fake affection. I knew you'd understand. You are the most wonderful, most supportive mother-in-law a girl could ask for. We are so grateful. Jason was practically vibrating with excitement. This is great, Mom. This is fantastic. You won't regret this, I promise. This is going to change everything for us. They were like children on Christmas morning, giddy and drunk on their victory. They immediately pulled out their phones, their fingers flying across the screens, their voices a torrent of excited chatter. I'm booking the flights right now. Crystal squealed. First class. Non-stop to Paris. Oh, I need to call the hotel, the George V, and confirm the suite with the Eiffel Tower view. I'll call the credit card company and get our limits increased. Jason said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. We can put the whole trip on the cards now and just pay it all off the second the check from the car clears. They were so lost in their greedy, celebratory haze that they didn't notice the cold, predatory stillness that had settled over me. They didn't see the glint in my eye. They saw only what they wanted to see. The dotty old mother who had finally seen reason, the walking, talking ATM that was finally ready to dispense their cash. I'll handle the sale, of course, I said, my voice gentle, reassuring. I know a few people in the business. I want to make sure we get a fair price for it. For you. Of course, Mom, of course, Jason said, waving a dismissive hand, his attention already back on his phone. Whatever you think is best. Just get the most you can for it, okay? Every dollar counts. They stayed for another hour, their conversation a dizzying, nauseating litany of their plans. They talked about the designer clothes they would buy, the Michelin-starred restaurants they would dine in, the exclusive parties they would attend. They talked about the content, the brand partnerships, the followers, the fame. They did not mention Franklin once. They did not spare a single thought for the man whose life's work was about to be liquidated to fund their fantasy. When they finally left, their faces flushed with triumph, they left behind a house that felt profoundly, blessedly quiet. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time listening to the silence. The bait had been taken. The trap was now set. They thought they had just secured their future. They had no idea they had just authorized their own spectacular, self-inflicted ruin. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, the mask of the pliant, defeated mother dissolved, and the cold, calculating mind of the woman who had run a multi-million-dollar business for 40 years took over. My first call was not to a scrapyard or a used car dealer. It was to the one person in the world who understood, with every fiber of her being, the sacredness of what had just been desecrated. I called Esther Cole. Esther and I had been friends for over 50 years. Our husbands, Franklin and her late husband, George, had been inseparable, two old-school craftsmen in a world that was rapidly losing its appreciation for their skills. We were war widows, in a sense, veterans of 1,000 late-night dinners kept warm while our husbands were lost in their respective garages, chasing the ghost of perfection. Esther knew the story of the Shelby. She had been there the day we dragged it out of that barn. She had brought us coffee and sandwiches on the long, cold nights Franklin had spent in the garage. She understood that the car was not just a car. It was a testament to a life, a marriage, a shared passion. She answered on the first ring, her voice a warm, familiar comfort. Vivian? Honey, is everything all right? And then the dam of my composure finally broke. The tears I had refused to shed in front of my son and his wife came in a hot, silent torrent. I told her everything. I told her about the demand, the insults, the ugly, screaming rage. And then I told her the final, unforgivable words, a rusty old bucket. The silence on the other end of the line was not the silence of sympathy. It was the silence of a gathering storm. Esther was a gentle church-going woman, but she possessed a core of steel and a capacity for righteous fury that was a wonder to behold. That ungrateful, money-grubbing little worm, she finally hissed, her voice a low, dangerous growl. And that plastic wife of his. How dare they? How dare they speak of Franklin's work that way? Vivian, you tell me where you've hidden the bodies and I will help you bury them. Her fierce, unwavering loyalty was the balm my wounded soul needed. I took a shaky breath and laughed, a real, genuine laugh for the first time in what felt like an eternity. No bodies, Esther. Not yet, anyway. I have a better idea. And then I told her the rest of the story. I told her about my sudden, chillingly calm agreement. I told her about their ecstatic, greedy celebration. I told her the bait had been laid. There was another pause, and then a slow, delighted chuckle rumbled down the line. Oh, Vivian Laurent, she said, her voice filled with a delicious, wicked glee. You are a dangerous, dangerous woman. I love it. It's perfect. It's what Franklin would have wanted. He always said the best revenge was a perfectly executed plan. I need your help, Esther, I said, my voice growing stronger, more confident. I need a strategist. I need someone to help me think through the details. You have my undivided attention, she said, her voice now all business. What's the first move? The first move, I said, is to let them dig their own grave. They're putting the entire trip on their credit cards, assuming a big payday is coming. We need to give them enough time to get in so deep they can never climb out. Poetic, Esther said with relish. Let their own greed be the shovel. I like it. So, we need to create the illusion of a slow, difficult sale. You're an old woman, you don't know about these things, it's taking you a while to find the right buyer. That sort of thing. Exactly, I said. And while they're racking up debt, we will be planning the main event. A stage. A spotlight. A public unveiling of their own spectacular foolishness. We spent the next hour mapping out the broad strokes of the plan. Esther, a retired history professor, was a natural strategist. She saw the narrative, the historical parallels, the beautiful, poetic justice of it all. She helped me refine the idea to see it not just as an act of revenge, but as a piece of theater, a morality play to be performed for a very specific audience. They are obsessed with image, with public perception, she said, her voice sharp with insight. So, their humiliation must be public. It must strike at the very heart of the fraudulent world they have built for themselves. We don't just take their money, Vivian. We take their credibility. We take their brand. By the time we hung up the phone, I felt like a different woman. The grieving, heartbroken mother had been replaced by a cold, calculating general preparing for a war she knew she was going to win. Esther had given me more than just support. She had given me a battle plan. She had reminded me of the formidable woman I had been for 40 years, the woman who had built an empire from behind a small wooden desk. That woman was back. And she was about to bring the full weight of her quiet, methodical power to bear on the two people who had so foolishly mistaken her patience for weakness. With the grand strategy mapped out with Esther, it was time to call in my weapon. I needed more than a plan. I needed an expert, an executioner, someone who could take my desire for a quiet, personal revenge and turn it into a spectacular world-class event. I needed Simone Dubois. Simone was one of the most powerful and respected classic car brokers in the world. She was a senior consultant for a major international auction house, a woman whose opinion could add or subtract $1 million from the value of a vehicle with a single discerning glance. She was a regular on television, a sought-after expert for magazines, a glamorous, high-powered figure in a world of immense wealth and passion. And she had learned everything she knew about the business side of that world from me, in the small, cluttered office of Laurent Restorations. She had come to us as a teenager, a foster kid on her last chance, filled with a wild, angry energy and a deep-seated mistrust of the world. She was on a path to nowhere fast. Franklin, who had a soft spot for any lost cause, gave her a job sweeping the floors. He saw a spark in her, a fierce, defiant intelligence that reminded him of a stubborn, untuned engine. He started teaching her the trade, letting her work on the cars, and he discovered she had a natural, intuitive feel for the machines. But it was I who saw her true gift. She had a brilliant mind for business. She was a natural negotiator, a keen observer of people, a woman who could read a room and understand the unspoken desires of the wealthy, powerful men who were our clients. I took her under my wing. I taught her how to research a car's provenance, how to build a network of contacts, how to structure a deal, how to spot a fake, and how to appreciate a masterpiece. I became the mother she never had, and she became the daughter I had always wished for. She had her father's passion, but she had my mind. When I called her private number, she answered immediately, her voice a warm, professional purr. "Vivian, it's so good to hear your voice. How are you holding up?" "I'm holding, Simone," I said. "But I need your help. Something has happened." I told her the story just as I had told Esther. I didn't have to elaborate. I didn't have to explain the significance of the Shelby. He knew. She had been there for the last 5 years of its restoration. She had helped me source the final, impossible-to-find parts. She revered Franklin, and she understood on a cellular level the depth of the insult my son had delivered. As I spoke, the warmth in her voice was replaced by a chilling, controlled fury. "He said what?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "That ignorant, entitled little boy. After everything you and Franklin did for him. After the legacy that man built with his own 2 hands. She fell silent for a moment, and I could almost hear the cold, calculating gears of her mind turning. "Vivian," she said, her voice now all business, a voice I knew had made grown billionaires tremble. "What do you want me to do? You name it and it's done." "I want to sell the car, Simone," I said. "Sell it?" she asked, a note of shock in her voice. "Vivian, you can't. It's Franklin's masterpiece." "I'm not selling it for the money," I explained. "I'm selling it for the lesson. I want to stage an event. A public spectacle. I want my son and his wife to be there front and center, when the world tells them exactly what that rusty old bucket is worth. A slow, predatory smile spread through Simone's voice. Oh, she said, the single word dripping with a beautiful, lethal understanding. Oh, I see. You don't just want to sell it. You want to create an execution. I love it. Her mind, her brilliant, strategic and deeply ruthless mind, immediately went to work. We won't just sell it at any auction, Vivian, she said, her voice quickening with a professional, predatory excitement. We will make it the headline car at the biggest, most prestigious event of the year. We'll get it on television. We'll create a media frenzy. I'll write the catalog description myself. I'll tell the story of Franklin Loron, the quiet genius in his small shop. I'll tell the story of the rent-a-racer. By the time that car rolls onto the block, every collector in the world will be watching, and they will be ready to go to war for it. And my son? I asked. Your son and his lovely wife, she said, her voice laced with a cold, sweet venom, will have front row seats to the most expensive and most public humiliation in automotive history. We won't just make them look foolish, Vivian. We will make them famous for their foolishness. We will destroy that silly little influencer's credibility so completely that she won't be able to get a free tube of lipstick from a drugstore. We will make them a laughingstock in the very world they are so desperate to impress. The sheer, comprehensive brilliance of her plan left me breathless. I had come to her with a simple desire for justice. She had given me a blueprint for total and utter annihilation. Consider it done, Vivian, she said, her voice softening with a fierce, protective love. Franklin saved my life. He gave me a future. The least I can do is help you deliver a little bit of Loron-style justice to the two people who have so spectacularly failed to appreciate either. They are about to find out what happens when you insult a legend. And they are about to learn the true price of disrespect. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in strategic deception and theatrical stagecraft. While Jason and Crystal were blissfully racking up thousands of dollars in debt, booking non-refundable hotel suites and buying extravagant new wardrobes for their imminent European triumph, Simone and I were quietly, methodically, and ruthlessly setting the stage for their downfall. Simone moved with the lethal efficiency of a predator. The first step was to create an official, unimpeachable record of the Shelby's value and provenance. She flew in a team of the world's top automotive historians and appraisers, men whose reputations were beyond reproach. They spent 2 days in my garage, going over every inch of the car, verifying serial numbers, analyzing paint thickness, and documenting the flawless, period-correct restoration. Their final report was a glowing, multi-page testament to Franklin's genius, and it ended with a certified appraisal value that was, even to me, staggering. It was not just a $1.5 million car. It was, in their expert opinion, potentially a $2 million car, given its rarity and the quality of the restoration. With the official valuation in hand, Simone went to work on the marketing. She crafted a narrative that was pure, intoxicating automotive mythology. She didn't just write a catalog description, she wrote a legend. She told the story of the mythical rent-a-racers, of the ordinary men who could be Carroll Shelby for a weekend. She told the story of Franklin Loron, the quiet, blue-collar artist who had dedicated 20 years of his life to resurrecting this one, perfect example of American muscle. She commissioned a world-class photographer to take a series of stunning, dramatic photos of the car, making it look less like a machine and more like a piece of priceless sculpture. The story and the photos went viral in the rarefied world of high-end car collecting. Magazines ran feature articles. Websites buzzed with speculation. The auction house, under Simone's expert guidance, released a series of tantalizing press releases, building the anticipation to a fever pitch. The 1966 Shelby GT350 H, the lost Loron masterpiece, became the most talked-about car of the auction season. Billionaires from around the world were registering to bid. The stage was being set for a record-breaking sale. Meanwhile, my role was to play the part of the slightly overwhelmed, slightly confused old woman, slowly and clumsily trying to sell her late husband's old car. I would call Jason every few days with a frustrating, rambling update. "Oh, Jason dear," I'd say, my voice a carefully crafted quaver of elderly confusion. "It's all so complicated. I spoke to a man today, a dealer, and he offered me $50,000. That seems like a lot, doesn't it?" $50,000? Jason would practically scream into the phone. "Mom, no. That's an insult. These old Mustangs can be worth a lot more than that. You have to be careful, these guys will try to cheat you. The irony was so thick, so delicious, I could barely contain my laughter. He was so convinced of his own superior knowledge, so certain he was protecting me from the sharks, that he had no idea he was the one being played. Finally, a week before the auction, I delivered the bait. "Jason, I have wonderful news," I said, my voice filled with a fake, triumphant excitement. "A very wealthy, very private collector has seen the car and he is extremely interested. He's a very serious man. He wants to buy it." "How much?" Jason demanded, his voice a low, hungry growl. "He didn't say," I lied. "He's very old-fashioned. He doesn't want to negotiate over the phone. He wants to finalize the deal in person. He's invited us to a small, private reception at the auction house where he keeps his collection. He said he'll have his bank cut a certified check right there." "An auction house?" Jason asked, a flicker of suspicion in his voice. "Oh, it's not an auction," I said, my voice a wave of airy reassurance. "Heavens no. It's just a reception. A formality. He just wants to shake our hands and make sure the car is going to a good home. He's a very sentimental man. He even said he'd be honored if you and Crystal would attend as my guests. He wants to meet the son of the great Franklin Loron." That was the final perfect hook. The appeal to his ego, the validation from a wealthy, private collector, was irresistible. He puffed up with pride, his suspicion replaced by a wave of smug self-importance. "Well, of course we'll be there," he said, his voice taking on a magnanimous tone. "It's the least I can do. To oversee the final transaction. To make sure everything is handled properly." The trap was set. The quarry was walking toward it, not with caution but with a proud, arrogant swagger. They had already spent over $50,000 on their credit cards. They were in deep and they were about to get buried. They were dressing for a party, for a celebration of their own cleverness. They had no idea they were getting ready for their own public execution. The night of the auction was a masterpiece of orchestrated cruelty, a symphony of humiliation conducted by Simone with the precision of a master. She had arranged for a private car to pick up Jason and Crystal, a small touch designed to lull them into a false sense of security, to make them feel like the VIPs they so desperately believed they were. They arrived at the venue, a vast, glittering hall that was once a historic city landmark, looking smug, triumphant, and laughably out of place. Crystal was wearing a tight, sequined dress that was more appropriate for a nightclub than a high-society gala. Jason was in a suit that was just a little too shiny, his hair slicked back, a look of profound self-satisfied greed on his face. They were dressed for a backroom deal, for a quick and dirty transaction. They were completely unprepared for the world they were about to walk into. I met them at the entrance, playing the part of the slightly flustered, slightly intimidated mother. "Oh, isn't this something?" I said, my eyes wide with feigned wonder. I had no idea it would be so fancy. "Don't worry, Mom," Jason said, patting my arm with a condescending familiarity. "Just stick with me. I'll handle everything." A young woman with a clipboard and an earpiece, one of Simone's assistants, approached us. "Mr. and Mrs. Loron? Miss Dubois has arranged for your seats. Right this way." She did not lead us to a quiet, private room. She led us through the throng of beautifully dressed billionaires, celebrities and world-renowned collectors, a crowd that radiated a quiet, effortless power that made Jason and Crystal's flashy, desperate wealth look cheap and tawdry. She led us to a small velvet-roped enclosure right at the front of the room, directly facing the stage. There were 3 chairs marked with a small discreet sign that read, "Reserved for the Loron family." Jason's face was a comical mask of confusion. "I thought this was a private reception," he whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. "Oh, I think the collector must have invited a few of his friends," I whispered back, my voice a perfect blend of innocence and awe. "Isn't that nice?" Before he could protest further, the lights dimmed and the auctioneer, a man with a silver mane of hair and a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. Jason and Crystal exchanged a bewildered, uneasy glance. They were trapped. They were in the front row, the guests of honor at a party they didn't understand, and the main event was about to begin. The first few cars rolled onto the stage, beautiful, expensive machines that sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. With each sale I could see the greed in Jason's eyes growing, his nervousness replaced by a frantic, excited energy. He was starting to believe that the private collector was even wealthier than he had imagined, that the check he was about to receive would be even larger than he had dreamed. And then it was time. The auctioneer's voice dropped, taking on a tone of hushed reverence. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," he said, "for the moment we have all been waiting for. The headline car of the evening. A lost masterpiece of American muscle. The car that has taken the collecting world by storm. From the legendary workshop of the late, great Franklin Loran. I give you the 1966 Shelby GT350 H." The doors at the back of the stage opened and the car rolled slowly into the spotlight. It was magnificent. The raven black paint was so deep it looked like a pool of liquid night. The gold stripes gleamed like solid bars of bullion. The engine, which Simone had arranged for a master detailer to start just before it came on stage, let out a low, guttural, earth-shaking rumble that vibrated through the floor of the entire hall. It was not a car, it was a presence. It was a legend come to life. A collective gasp went through the room. And on the massive screens on either side of the stage, the television cameras, under Simone's expert direction, cut to a close-up shot of Jason and Crystal's faces. Their expressions were a priceless, unforgettable mixture of slack-jawed, stupefied shock. Their mouths were literally hanging open. Their eyes were wide with a dawning, horrified and deeply, deeply greedy understanding. This was it. This was the rusty old bucket. The auctioneer began his speech, a beautiful, poetic tribute to Franklin, written by Simone herself. He told the story of the restoration, of the 20 years of love and labor that had gone into this one perfect machine. And with every word, the cameras cut back to Jason and Crystal, capturing their slow, agonizing transition from confusion to avarice. Then the bidding began. "I have an opening bid of $500,000, the auctioneer boomed. Jason's head snapped toward me, his eyes bulging with a frantic, questioning greed. I just gave him a small, beatific smile and a little shrug as if to say, "Isn't this a wonderful surprise?" $750,000. $1 million. The bids came in a flurry, a rapid-fire volley from all corners of the room. The numbers climbed at a dizzying, sickening pace. 1.2 million. 1.4. The room was electric. The collectors were in a frenzy. $1.5 million, the auctioneer cried, his voice ringing with excitement. He looked directly at our little enclosure. "And the family of the great Franklin Loran is here with us tonight to witness this historic moment." Every eye in the room, every camera turned to us. Jason and Crystal were frozen, their faces a ghastly, pale green, their greedy smiles looking like the terrified grimaces of two people on a roller coaster that had just gone off the rails. Their public humiliation was complete. They were not the savvy in-the-know deal-makers. They were the fools, the ignorant children who had no idea of the value of their own inheritance. And the whole world was watching. The bidding finally slowed, a tense, dramatic battle between two unseen bidders on the phone. The final price was a staggering, record-breaking $1,850,000. The gavel fell with a deafening crack. The room erupted in applause. And on the giant screens, for one last glorious, excruciating moment, the cameras lingered on the shocked, greedy, and utterly humiliated faces of my son and his wife. In the chaotic, celebratory aftermath of the auction, Jason and Crystal were transformed. The shock and humiliation they had so publicly endured were instantly erased by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated greed. The fact that they had been made to look like fools in front of the entire world didn't matter. The fact that they had insulted a car that was now a national news story didn't matter. All that mattered was the number, $1,850,000. They were no longer confused or embarrassed. They were ecstatic. They were multimillionaires. As Simone's assistants escorted us from the front row to a private velvet-roped VIP lounge, they were practically vibrating with a manic, triumphant energy. Jason had his arm around my shoulder, a gesture not of affection but of ownership. Crystal was clinging to my other arm, her voice a high-pitched, breathless squeal. "Mom, can you believe it?" Jason was saying, his voice a loud, booming laugh that was several shades too hearty. $1,850,000. I knew it. I told you that car was special. I always had a feeling about it. The lie was so audacious, so shameless that it was almost impressive. He was already rewriting history, casting himself not as the ignorant fool, but as the savvy visionary who had recognized the car's hidden value all along. "Vivian, you are a genius," Crystal gushed, her eyes shining with a $sign glint. "That whole auction thing, it was a brilliant strategy. Playing hard to get, creating a bidding war. Absolutely brilliant. You're a much better businesswoman than we ever gave you credit for." They were fawning over me, praising me, their words a thick, cloying syrup of insincere flattery. They were no longer the bullies, the tormentors. They were my biggest fans, my most ardent supporters. They were like hyenas, giggling and dancing around a freshly killed wildebeest, eager for the feast to begin. The lounge was a quiet, luxurious haven after the noise and chaos of the auction floor. Champagne was flowing. Simone was there, a cool, elegant smile on her face, accepting the congratulations of the auction house executives. She caught my eye and gave me a slow, deliberate wink. The final act was about to begin. Jason and Crystal, now completely consumed by their fantasies, began to plan their new life out loud, their voices a rapid-fire duet of conspicuous consumption. "We can buy the house in the Hamptons now," Crystal said, her eyes wide with the possibilities. "The one with the pool and the tennis court. And a new G-Wagon. In white. Forget the real estate license," Jason declared, puffing out his chest. "I'm done with that. I'm an investor now. A venture capitalist. We can start our own fund. The Loron Group. It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" They were so lost in their delirious, greedy daydream that they were completely oblivious to the cold, quiet calm that had settled over me. They were painting a beautiful picture of their future. A future built on a foundation of money they believed was theirs. They had no idea I was about to take a can of gasoline and a match to their masterpiece. Finally, the auction house's finance director, a man with a kind, professional smile, approached us with a leather-bound folder. "Mrs. Loron," he said, shaking my hand warmly. "Congratulations on a truly historic sale. An absolute triumph. We have the preliminary paperwork here for the transfer of funds. The money, minus the house commission, will be wired to your account within 3 business days." This was the moment they had been waiting for. Jason stepped forward, practically pushing the finance director out of the way. He clapped his hands together, a gesture of final, triumphant closure. "Fantastic," he boomed. "So, where do we sign?" "We'd like the funds wired directly to our account, of course. It'll be simpler that way." He looked at me, a wide, expectant, possessive smile on his face. Crystal stood beside him, her hand outstretched as if she were expecting the man to simply hand her a bag of cash. They were holding out their hands, their faces alight with the pure, unadulterated joy of a dream about to be realized. They were ready for their check. They were ready for their new life. They had no idea they were actually standing on a trapdoor and I was about to pull the lever. I let the moment hang in the air, a perfect, beautiful, terrible silence. I looked at my son's smiling, expectant face. I looked at my daughter-in-law's greedy, shining eyes. I savored the last few seconds of their blissful, ignorant happiness. And then I began my speech, the one I had been rehearsing in my head for weeks. "Actually, Jason," I said, my voice as calm and as clear as a ringing bell, "the funds won't be going to your account. They'll be going to mine." The smiles on their faces faltered, replaced by a flicker of confused uncertainty. "What?" Jason said, his laugh a little too loud, a little too forced. "What are you talking about, Mom? Don't be silly. We're all family here. Just have them send it to us. It's our money." "No, dear," I said, my voice still gentle, still calm, but with an underlying edge of pure, unyielding steel. "It's my money. It was my car. And I have some very specific plans for it." I turned to the finance director who was watching the exchange with a practiced, professional neutrality. "The first transfer," I said, my voice clear and authoritative, "will be for $500,000. It will be wired to this account." I handed him a piece of paper, prepared by Simone's legal team. "It is the seed money for a new charitable organization I am establishing. It will be called the Franklin Loron Foundation." Jason and Crystal stared at me, their faces blank with a lack of comprehension. "The foundation," I continued, turning my gaze back to them, "will have a very simple, very clear mission. It will provide scholarships and grants to gifted young men and women who wish to attend trade schools. It will help them become the next generation of master mechanics, of welders, of craftsmen. It will be a tribute to your father, Jason. A way to honor the blue-collar world you were so ashamed of. The word ashamed landed like a slap. Jason flinched. The color was beginning to drain from his face. 500,000? Crystal whispered, her voice a horrified squeak. You're giving away $500,000? Oh, don't worry, Crystal, I said, turning to her, my face breaking into a warm, beatific smile. I haven't forgotten about you. In fact, I have some wonderful news. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a glossy travel brochure, the very one she had shown me in my kitchen weeks ago. I opened it to a page detailing a first-class 5-country European tour. I was so inspired by your presentation, I said, my voice dripping with a sweet, vicious sincerity. It sounded so wonderful, so life-changing. The George V in Paris, the villa overlooking Lake Como, the private tour of the Uffizi Gallery. It all sounded simply divine. So I booked it. A flicker of desperate, confused hope appeared in her eyes. I booked it for myself, I said, my smile never wavering. First class all the way. I leave next Tuesday. I've decided that the next $1 million from the sale of the car will be my personal travel fund. I'm going to see the world. I'm going to enjoy the fruits of my husband's labor. But don't you worry your pretty little head. I reached out and patted her cheek, a gesture of profound, patronizing dismissal. I'll be sure to send you both plenty of postcards. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. And the rest. Jason finally managed to choke out, his voice a strangled, desperate rasp. The rest of the money? The rest of the money, I said, looking him directly in the eye, is for me. For my life. For my future. A future in which you will not be participating. You wanted me to sell the car. I sold the car. You wanted the money. This is what I'm doing with the money. You will not see one single cent of it. Not now. Not ever. The finality of my words, the sheer, comprehensive and beautifully petty totality of their defeat finally landed. They stood there in the middle of the glittering VIP lounge, their faces a ghastly, silent tableau of ruin. They had lost. They had lost everything. And the worst part, the part one knew would haunt them for the rest of their miserable, grasping lives, was that they had done it all to themselves. The aftermath was a quiet, slow-motion collapse. There was no dramatic, screaming confrontation in the VIP lounge. My victory was so total, so absolute that it left no room for argument. Jason and Crystal simply stood there, their faces pale and slack with shock as I calmly signed the paperwork, shook the finance director's hand and walked out of the room with Simone at my side. They were left behind, two ghosts at a party that had suddenly, brutally ended. Their financial ruin was swift and merciless. The $50,000 debt they had so gleefully accrued on their credit cards was now an anchor, dragging them down into a sea of interest payments and late fees. With no windfall to save them, the bill came due. Jason's real estate commissions, which had been slowing down in a cooling market, were not nearly enough to cover the hole they had dug for themselves. They were forced to sell Crystal's car. They had to cancel their country club membership. They had to face the quiet, daily humiliation of living a life they could no longer afford. Crystal's influencer career, the very thing this entire sordid affair was meant to elevate, was obliterated overnight. The clips of her face, a mask of slack-jawed greed at the auction, had gone viral. She became a meme, a laughingstock, a symbol of ignorant avarice. The luxury brands that had been interested in her suddenly couldn't be reached. Her followers, who had been eagerly awaiting her glamorous European tour, were instead treated to a deafening silence. Her brand, built on a fantasy of effortless wealth, was exposed as a fraud. She had nothing to offer but the bitter, unglamorous reality of her own self-inflicted downfall. They didn't call me. I think on some level they knew it was useless. They had burned the bridge, salted the earth and poisoned the well. There was no going back. I heard through the grapevine that their marriage was crumbling under the weight of their shared failure and recriminations. It was a partnership built on the shared dream of unearned wealth, and with that dream gone, they had nothing left to hold them together. As for me, I did exactly what I said I was going to do. The Franklin Loron Foundation was established within a month, its coffers filled with $500,000, ready to help a new generation of young people discover the quiet dignity of working with their hands. It was the most fitting tribute I could imagine for my husband, a legacy of creation and opportunity, funded by the very masterpiece his own son had despised. And then I packed my bags. I didn't just book the European tour. I booked a trip around the world. Vivian Laurent, the woman who had spent her life in a small town, running a business and raising a family, was finally going to see the world. I was going to use the money Franklin and I had earned to live, to experience, to learn. I was going to honor his memory not by sitting in a quiet, lonely house, but by embracing the life he would have wanted for me. My story ends as all good stories should, with a postcard. Several months after the auction, I found myself sitting at a small, sun-drenched cafe in a piazza in Rome. The air was warm, the coffee was strong, and the sound of the ancient city buzzed around me like a beautiful, living symphony. I had spent the morning walking through the Forum, imagining the ghosts of emperors and artisans, and I felt a sense of peace, of rightness, that I had not felt since Franklin had passed. I took out a pen and a postcard, a beautiful, glossy picture of the Colosseum. I thought for a long moment about what to write, about the hundreds of angry, bitter, triumphant things I could say. But in the end, I chose a message of simple, devastating, and beautifully petty truth. I wrote, "Jason, having a wonderful time. You were right, it was time to let that old bucket go. It's funding a much better journey. Love, Mom." I dropped it in a bright red postbox, its journey to my son's small, sad, rented apartment now begun. I knew it would not bring him remorse or understanding or enlightenment, but it would bring him a message. A message from a world away, from a life he could have been a part of but had chosen to reject. A message that said, "You made your choice. And I, my dear, am living with mine. And it is glorious.